Hi, and welcome to the Thank God for the Beatles podcast. If this is your first time, welcome, and if you are returning, it's great to have you back. I'm your host, Karen, and joining me today is my brother, Jeff. Hey, Jeff.
Hi, everybody. Good to be back. We missed you.
Well, we had life intervening in the time away, and that's just kind of what happens. But anyway, today our podcast is all about Revolver, the 1966 album from the Beatles that some say has eclipsed Sgt. Pepper's and others as the greatest album. So that's up for discussion, and I'm sure that everybody has their own opinion on that. And what we do know about this album is that it represents the Beatles seeing into the future with electronic music, world music, advanced recording techniques, and songs and lyrics that were not of the norm, that they were, outside of what other bands and what other people were thinking at the time. And, let's not forget the drugs too. So there's a cornucopia of all kind of good things happening with Revolver. And, in 1966, the Beatles, the end of 65, Brian Epstein went to them and it was their formula, which was, we'll do another feature film, we'll do an album to support that, and then we'll have our tour. And the Beatles kind of said, no, we're not going to do that. I think that by the time we reach the end of 65, is that they're growing as recording engineers within the studio themselves, and that was that desire to propel themselves further and of what was possible within the studio. So here they're wanting to really push the envelope even more, and they're having all these new experiences, and those personal experiences really came through in this album.
Sure.
As well as the competition from other artists too.
And we have to remember the reason that they probably said no is they were fed up with touring because they couldn't hear themselves play. There were no foldback speakers. They didn't have the technology we take for granted now. So it was not a pleasant experience. Nobody was really hearing the music. It was more about idol, young girls and idol worship then, and that's not what they wanted to be about. They wanted to be taken more seriously as musicians. And they just wanted out of that pattern, and they didn't want to keep digging deeper into that pattern. I think it's very telling that after they made this record, and they didn't play any songs from it because they wanted to make songs that at that point could not be replicated live. So, and my first impression of the record, when I was 11 years old, is, oh, this is how it's supposed to be. I guess you can do almost anything. You can make all kinds of circus noises. You can do vaudeville. You can have ballads. You can have rock. And what's all this weird sitar stuff? My first impression is that you could do almost anything was possible on this record. So it opened up so much, and I really loved it. I loved the songs on it, and I said, wow, I've never heard anything like that. But for me, that set a template of this must be what the new normal is. It kind of shaped the beginning of what we understand or characterize as the 60s. So for me as a young boy, and the way that I hear it now, I kind of agree with the revisionist critical perception now, that this is one of the finest albums that they made. It's a personal favorite of mine, this album, because of just its variance and creativity. Somehow it holds together. Is it really a concept album? No. I don't think it's a concept album, but I think it's an album where, okay, we're going to just try everything that we can to find new sounds and make this interesting for us. And by doing so for themselves, they made it interesting for the rest of us and open musical doors for so many different genres. I can't even begin to tell you. Electronica and every single, today, you have to say, every single musician from Jay-Z on, to all the Pet Shop Boys and all these, they all owe, and the progressive rock people, all of them owe their roots to this record that opened those doors in one way or another. It made all these different rock, ELO, all these guys, they wouldn't have a career without this record.
Well, when you take a look at the album cover that their dear friend from Hamburg, Klaus Vormann, designed with input from them, they wanted to do a collage, and they brought their own photos. In fact, one of the photos that Paul gave and that was inserted into the first draft of the album cover was a famous photo of him sitting on the toilet in Hamburg. I think he has like a little bowling cap on, and they decided to take that out, and Paul was cool with that. But the line drawings, I mean, phenomenal. But if you really flip that cover and you look at the black and white photo of them, it's that serious swinging. It's just kind of
it sets up the so-called psychedelia hipster kind of look where they wore floral clothes and huge sunglasses.
Well, they had the colorful
outfits, right?
And even though they all had sunglasses on, it was like they had their own unique style within the sunglasses. They also had their unique clothes. And John was wearing more of the, what do you call it, a paisley shirt.
Right.
Paul looks traditional.
Right.
And George had a beautiful, some type of velvet jacket. So they're finding how their dress and for young guys,
it's individualism. I think it presages individualism. It's showing that they weren't all wearing the same suits anymore. That was a complete, total break from that previous image. They wanted to basically introduce themselves as serious musicians, taking rock in a direction that says, well, yes, rock and roll is fun, but it's also a creative venture for us. And, join us in that adventure. And they showed more of their individual selves through these songs that we'll discuss. It's just...
and I do feel often people say that the White Album, it was like the four Beatles or individuals making an album.
Right.
I would say that almost this album is a little bit closer to that, at least the dynamic between John and Paul, and where Paul was helpful to John. Paul, it seems like he came in with his own songs that were pretty much finished and needed George Martin's assistance in getting them complete, or outside horn players or whatever it may be. So I just think, just in hindsight and thinking about this album overall, it's kind of like this is like the beginning of that stage. And Jeff, we were talking earlier, and you had made a really good point about, first of all, we're going to be talking about the original release, which is 14 songs, not how Capitol pulls songs because they only want to do 11 songs because they're trying to stretch it out. And
that's why the Beatles rewrote their contract. Their contract actually expired when they made the record. So they were making a record very cheeky. They made a record that without an actual record deal or contract. So in January 1967, they signed a new contract. They said, no more of you cutting up our records. That's it. We're, no more of that. They changed that. They didn't have good terms. They started in 1963, so Capitol could have free reign to do what they wanted. And of course, they didn't appreciate that at all. And by the time they got through this record, I unfortunately had experienced a few of these tracks on that horrible compilation that Capitol put together yesterday and to Beatles Yesterday and Today with that boring album cover with them sitting,
around the trunk. It's awful.
Right. It was just, but I love the songs on it, and we'll discuss that. But 3 of those songs we'll talk about were not on this record that should have been. And now I can see with the British release, which is far preferable, of course, had those songs on them and why they made sense on this album. So now that I have an even greater appreciation for that those songs are on there, because I thought that, Paul and George's songs tended to dominate this record more because Paul was definitely coming of age on this record, while John came of age on Rubber Soul, right, as writers. But John's contributions were, excised, some of them, and put on another record. So that creates a totally different impression in the United States. So now that we have the complete record, I can see how it all hangs together, and they all contributed amazing songs to this record. And now I can see as one piece when you think of it as an album. This is how it was intended. And I love And Your Bird Can Sing, but that was not on the record when I was growing up.
Correct. That's right.
So...
Well, and the other thing to think about is that the Beatles, the individuality is that they were starting to live their own life. And we've talked about this before, how Paul was London-based and could walk to Abbey Road, and the other Beatles lived out in the country with their wives.
Right, and John was doing those famous interviews in 1966 with Maureen Cleave, and which she found characterized him as somewhat lazy, and bored with fame and bored and not too happy living in that well-to-do neighborhood. He wanted more.
Well, and then Paul was doing the art gallery avant-garde, being heavily influenced by that, going to theater and, avant-garde music. So he's absorbing all of these influences. But what's interesting is that even though he's doing that, his songs are much more traditional.
Right.
Whereas John
and George
are really
going out on a limb. They're really
Correct.
taking a lot more. Well, they took more chances earlier, I would suppose. But then again, after they recorded a number of these tracks, as you know the timeline, you can quote the dates, but I think around May 1st, a bunch of them had gone into London to experience the new London scene that was opening up. It became the central hub of the new movement, of artists. They were watching plays, they were visiting things. So all of them had gone out, I think, on a particular day. I can't remember exactly what had happened on that outing, but I think that they were all kind of getting caught up.
I vaguely recall that there's, maybe it was something called Dolly's, I can't remember, that there was a nightclub that maybe George had helped financially a little bit, and that they were
he had a stake in
out
it.
and living the 60s life. Must have been so exciting. I just would give anything to have been 22 years old in London
at that time.
Yes,
right.
To be a part of that scene, or at least have the opportunity to be a part of that scene. So this album, and I will say that the other thing to think about is that here the Beatles are getting more independent. They're getting more powerful because of their success. And as we've talked throughout this series of podcasts that we do, is that the relationship between George Martin and the boys has changed. And, I think that the Beatles are leading the way, and George Martin fills in how best to complement them.
And he did so with the new 4-track machine, I think, that they put in the control room. So there was the evolution of 2-track to 4 tracks.
That might have been sooner. I don't know.
Was it sooner than that? Probably. I don't know. But the 4-track, but he and Jeff Emmerich had to help create the sounds, because John himself was not known as being very technically proficient. I recall that George Martin would have to try to describe what the automatic double tracking known as ADT that was invented by Ken Townsend was an invention he just loved, because he thought that doubling the track manually, vocally, was a pain. He didn't like doing it. So John thought, oh, great. And can you do this? So he called it the flange. He says, Ken, and so George talking to George Martin, can you flange my voice? So, but what it is, it's like two tape recorders going at the same time and oscillating. It's an artificial double tracking. You're singing it once, but because of slight variance in the tape speeds and playback, it sounds as if two people, they're doing double tracking themselves, and they use that effect all over the record. And of course, John loved that, but he wasn't satisfied with that. I mean, we'll talk more about that.
And that's still you. Well, I will point you to an earlier podcast that we did that really focused on the recording techniques and innovations of the Beatles, and a lot of it comes at Revolver, and that's in depth. Here we're going to talk more about the songs and maybe some of the alternate takes. Things like that, and just how we feel about the music. And so let me just think if there's anything else. We'll get to that in a moment, though. Let's just kick it right into it. Let's just get started.
Yeah, let's just go.
So side 1, Taxman.
The first song really just kicks major butt. First of all, the count off, 1, 2, 3. But when they go into that, it doesn't even sync up with the rest of it. But that kind of sets the tone. There's an opening, and then it just hits you hard with the guitar riff. And that what's that type of bass that Paul's playing on it? It's called a Glissando inflected bass part, sounding like Motown. But the song's not Motown. The song is like a social commentary. It's a sneer against the British government at that time of Labour Party. Harold Wilson had a 95% tax rate on unearned income, meaning interest on savings and all that stuff. Because they were top earners, he said, isn't this a little high? And so George wrote that biting commentary, and he got a little help on that, I think, from John. I think George and John were hooking up more in terms of creativity. George was seeking out input from John, but then Paul would contribute the biting Indian influenced guitar solo on that, and also recorded separately and added at the end. It repeats that guitar in the outro, and it's brilliant guitar playing by that. And it really like took me by surprise, growing up and as I get older and finding out that it was Paul that played that lead, and I'm thinking, oh God, what a great guitar player George is. Well, George is a great guitar player in many, many respects and plays the best slide and creates beautiful leads. But for some reason, I mean, he just went in and tore this thing up and really gave it some fire. So he felt some passion for the song, and it really rocks. And it's a bit dark, and you see the dark corruption and foreboding. And
well, I would say that with George Harrison, his songs are cutting.
Yeah,
there's
a rock edge
other than something, and I'd have to look at, but there's always a cutting. There's an edge, and perhaps that's the influence just to who George is, which is this, built-in angst. I mean, I don't know, but it's.
No, I think he's just moody. George could be moody and dour. He could be funny and open and fun, but I think that there's another side to him that was just, okay, enough of this. He would get tired of.
Don't bother me.
Right.
It's just all of these things. He
had a lot less. I think he had a lot
persnickety.
less patience than other people with other people's nonsense. So, and when this was his first big Beatles departure, is they weren't singing about boy and girl songs anymore. They were not direct, not all the time. They were tackling other subjects, and that was a great. What a great opener for a record. It just really gets you going.
Well, and then the bass is, as a bass player myself, it's, when you're 13 or 14 years old, that's a song that you want to learn how to play. And it's hard to play as Paul plays it because he has his unique style, and he's playing it. I mean, you can play the notes, but he has a certain swing to it that he adds to his bass playing, and it's like almost like a doubling effect sometimes, and so you really have to listen carefully. And I just think sometimes he plays loose, and that looseness comes into it. But it's
I wouldn't know. I mean, I would attribute that to him being left-handed, and so naturally the technique is going to vary.
I don't know about that, but I did read that someone was saying, well, maybe he plays such great leads because he's a left-handed guitar player. And I'm like, well, I don't know about that. I just think he was inspired by that Casino guitar that he has. And he's a frustrated musician. He was a frustrated drummer and a guitarist, and, he could do it all. And it must have been, don't hold him back.
Right. Well,
right?
They gave George a great opening on this one. George, I don't think any of his songs have ever opened a Beatles record before.
Correct.
And so that was a big shift. And you definitely heard in George Harrison's vocal tons of that ADT technology and what we call compression in the studio used on his voice. So it sounds like two Georges singing, or it strengthens his vocal performance on it. So it was just perfect for it. I thought they used that everything to great effect. Is a perfect album opener.
Yeah, and in one of the alternate takes on Anthology, they have like this where the Beatles are like singing in between a background, and it's too hard to replicate, but I'm so glad they cut that. It just didn't work with the song at all. You'd have to go back to the Anthology album and listen to that, where they're just singing something very quickly. I don't know if you remember that. Do you remember that, Jeff?
No.
Okay, you have to go back and listen to that.
Okay. But anyway, we sliding that, and then you move into Eleanor Rigby. And you have this, again, another dark story, narrative about the perils of loneliness, Father Mackenzie. And he tells you right at the end that we know that Eleanor Rigby passes away, and she dies off in the song. So these two songs are been described as kind of a very dark opening for a Beatles record. It wasn't exactly, again, that was, I think maybe, I don't know how much of that was conscious on their part, but the way that it's structured, it's definitely a total departure and shift away from the happy I love you, you love me kind of, and rock and Mr. Moonlight, the songs they covered. It's nothing like that at all. It was a total break from that.
Well, recently I gave one of my colleagues the McCartney, quote unquote, poetry book, which has his lyrics in as poetry and some of his poems that he wrote. And I tagged for her Eleanor Rigby, because it really does read as it could be a poem, standalone poem without any music. It's an incredible lyric.
Well, the other Beatles actually contributed on that lyric. Even Pete Shonton. There are other people that were in the room. Harrison, Starr, and Shonton all contributed to help, shore up that lyric on Eleanor Rigby. The story was intact, but they actually assisted with the lyric.
But on its own, I mean, it's such an amazing lyric. And then Paul says that he originally had Father McCartney as the priest.
Right, there was a Father McCartney thing. And
they went through the Yellow Pages, and then they kind of scrolled down to McCartney, and then they came up with Mackenzie.
Right, something with the same rhythmic pattern. It's Father Mackenzie. Well, it worked, and it's also, again, one of the first tracks where none of the actual Beatles actually play on that song. It's a string octet that was arranged by George Martin, an octet meaning 8 players, and he wanted it with no reverb. It was wanted a very stark type of playing that the classical musicians in Britain were excelled at. And George Martin said he was inspired by the scoring of the movie Psycho, Hitchcock's movie, with this staccato, the same that you heard from that theme. Well, if you listen to the backing of Eleanor Rigby, it's got that same kind of, a similar kind of urgency and drama in the playing, and then you have 3 of the Beatles singing on it. You have John and George backing in the vocal on the chorus, Look at All the Lonely People. And it was a single in England as well, and rose very high up in England, but did not get released. It released as a
B-side in the US because they felt it was
tended to be a double B.
Something with too religious.
Right, to be a double A-side, too religious, and the only reason they said that they thought it was too religious is because of around that time in '66, just a lot of things were happening. That the album was overshadowed in the American public because of John's comment to Maureen Cleave about the Beatles being bigger than Christ, but he was referring to England, and he was referring to the popularity, not reveling in it. He's just stating it as a fact of life. It's like, well, unbelievable fact of life. And so the American public, of course, did not take that very well, or it was distorted and not taken very well. So in press conferences, they would not get asked about the record. And so that kind of overshadowed it. So therefore, I think that led to the attitude of the record executives. Well, let's not put out Eleanor Rigby because, again, that's the religious connotations, and put out a happy-go-lucky Yellow Submarine, which is fine. That reached number 2. That was the first, and because of that, that was like the first Beatles single that did not hit number 1 on
Yellow Submarine
in the United States. Right, United States and England did great, and in the U.S. it was not not number 1, because they chose that song. And nothing wrong with it. It's a fun little song.
Now, there are pictures of an Eleanor Rigby headstone in Liverpool.
Maybe he saw one,
and so maybe he saw that in, But
well, sure. I mean, they were just like when John took lyrics from a poster or a story, and he would, or Paul would see a headstone, and he'd come up with a story and create a character. Paul became a storyteller on this record, more so.
And it shows that Paul's very capable of very deep and
thoughtful lyrics.
Mm-hmm. But I guess you can't. It's hard to do over 50.
And it's not a love song.
No, it's a commentary on life,
on loneliness.
That's correct.
Right.
And so it's
right.
Big boy topics.
The big boy topics. The first 2 songs create a bit of an ominous tone, and then it kind of eases and shifts into I'm Only Sleeping, which was not on the original American release, but I'm Only Sleeping is one of my very favorite songs. It's written mainly by John, and it's like half acid dream, half latent Lennon laziness personified, is described by Peter Doggett, an author. And something similar to Rain, he used plenty of that ADT technology, and he wanted to replicate a papery old man's voice. So they recorded, and Harrison recorded 2 separate lines, first with a clean sound, and the second he plays Gibson through a fuzz box. So you had these effects, and then you had the guitars, the backward guitars. That's a great feature. So another technical feat was the backwards guitar, which they practiced on this.
And George Martin would say after this album, it was backwards forever.
Yeah.
Everything.
It was backwards, everything. They wanted to do everything backwards over and over. But it worked.
They had to really plan the solo backwards. I mean, they really had to work on how it was going to sound. It wasn't just this random thing. It was a well-planned.
Oh, listen to what they did on it too. There was even points where John goes, "Hey, boom, 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 boom." You hear a little bass line where the song almost completely stops. It is like a dream. It's very dreamlike quality, and the great bridge, "Keeping an eye while the world's going by through my window,"
with Paul's harmony. Yes,
and that was just like, it's a killer. It's just great stuff. And it's like, that is like perfect John. His personality coming through completely on this song. It's a technical wonder, and it makes a great number. It like pulls you deeper into the dream world, and kind of the drugginess that influenced the record, their experimentation with LSD, which is very well known. Although Ringo would say, well, we didn't really take that much when we were actually working, because we worked very hard. But of course, the influence was obviously there. And then that song leads you to a great shock, hearing George Harrison's "Love You Too," which, although he had just playfully used sitar on Norwegian wood, this time full-blown Indian influenced music, and the Beatles are not playing on it, from my understanding of "Love You Too." It's a sitar, and he had other musicians. This is where they first time, I think, when they started being comfortable enough to bring in outside musicians. And on "Love You Too," it's basically a song about gratification, immediate physical gratification, and let's drop our inhibitions and all of that. And that's what that song is. And it has changes in tempo. It's just, he's basically delving deep into the Indian classical music.
Droning of Indian style music, but again, to the cutting lyrics. What's the lyric? I can't. There's people standing around who'll screw you in the ground.
They'll fill you in with all their sins. You'll see. Yeah. Okay.
So he's also taking a little bit of the philosophy of he's just diving into what's happening with, his studies of Eastern philosophy, and frankly, the taking of LSD, which is opening up their minds to new expression or new whatever thoughts, feelings. It's just
it was influenced by his experimentation for sure, and the sitar. And he played a fuzz-tone electrified guitar on it, but it was different. I tend to skip the track sometimes because I'm not in the mood to listen to George, to listen to that.
The funny thing, what John said is that apparently George had a hard time with titles. And so they gave, I don't know if it was for this one, but one of his songs on this one was they just called it Granny Smith. And then Granny Smith. And so isn't it interesting, a Granny Smith apple? And here's the Apple logo later on.
Right. They used it later. Right. Everything they used. And "Love You Too" to what? They used "two" with one O. "Love You Too" somewhere. Not "Love You Too," TOO, like "Love You Also." So that was a little different. And then we transitioned into, I think, one of the masterpieces of balladry, where Paul just regally comes in, and with this intro, again, they use these intros on this record that really have nothing to do with the tempo of what follows. So he has this very loose intro to "Lead a Better Life, I Need My Love to Be Here." That's not repeated anywhere. And then goes into the basic of the song, "And I Wander Everywhere." And John said it was his favorite ballad. The one compliment he'd given Paul, I think, for me personally, I think is one of the, in terms of expressing romantic love, this song does it more effectively than I've heard almost anyone do it. And what I really love about the recording of it, it's very soft. There's still drums on it, but it's very soft. The cymbals are soft. The guitar playing is very gentle. And what the really killer thing for me that drives it home is the harmony underneath it. When you hear John, Paul, and George all together doing the ooze part, so they really, better than a barbershop quartet could ever do. I mean, they just went in and layered that they treated it with great reverence, I thought, and it just adds to the elegance of the track. And if you listen to the lyrics, lyrically, you can imagine yourself, in the Mediterranean, or you're in your villa or on a veranda, and you're having, this fantastic person with you, and you're experiencing, it's almost like a it's the epitome of romance, and that's representative in that song.
It's one of my least favorite Paul songs.
I'm sorry.
I'll just tell you why. It's too slow for me. It's just too slow.
Right.
I mean, it's just like, it's
a beautiful melody. It doesn't matter.
And I find it to be cloying. And
cloying?
I just don't care for it. It's just pure sap, and I just like flip it off. I do like the stripped down version. There's a version that I found on YouTube where there's piano in the background.
Yeah, we heard that one. Yeah, I like that one too. I mean, it's got the piano and stuff, and that's really a pretty version of it. And then he did a live one, I think, in '91. I've heard him do it a couple times.
There's another group, I think it's called, if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, Belarus, Belarus, and they did a cover of it, which I find far superior. So I'm just not, this one doesn't do it for me. If I was going to pick a Paul love song, I mean, my number one would be "And I Love Her."
Yeah. But
this one,
well, listeners, I will leave that judgment up to you. I'm sorry, I just could not disagree more. So, I think the song is a romantic masterpiece. But moving on,
then we have Yellow Submarine. Which is
their token. They call it. It's like a token song for Ringo to sing, but it's much more than that.
Because remember, they decided not to do covers.
Right.
And so they needed original material. And Paul had started or written some of the song in the vein of it being a children's book, a children's story. And Paul, I think, has said in one of his interviews, there were no big words or no challenging words in there. It was just very, and I'm like, oh, okay.
No big words, no challenging words. Oh. Well, basically, I think it was like they were influenced by Spike Jones and the Goon Show, because you had all these sound effects and answering, and then John chiming in the middle, shouting captain's orders. And then you have the whole crew of people at the end singing along with the chorus and adding, to the effects. They were splicing tapes and it just pulling from the EMI library. They had the brass band playing. It was,
and what they had to do with that brass band is that it was a certain march that they had, and they had George Martin had them slice the tape, and then had Jeff Emmerich put it in different order. And apparently Jeff Emmerich, he randomly put them together, but it sounded like the original thing. And so he made it do it again. And how they did it, they added some other things to really change it. Otherwise they would have had to get permission and play a royalty.
Right. And they also had received the lyrical help with some of the storyline from Scottish singer, all know as Donovan.
Correct.
Donovan Leitch from the 60s, who was himself
Sky of Blue and Sea of Green.
That's right, Sky of Blue and Sea of Green. He was no slouch. He was an excellent folky rock singer-songwriter, definitely in the psychedelia era. And
Paul had gone to his home.
Right.
And he said he must have
he didn't take any credit on there, but it's known that he was on it, and everybody was on there. Their roadies, Mal Evans, Neil Aspinall. They had Marianne Faithfull. They had Patty Harrison, which is George Harrison's wife. They had everybody singing along or doing something on that song. It's meant as a novelty and a children's song, and to this day, it's now used in music classes. I know this because I actually had helped a group of kids learn that for their concert in high school. So a bunch of kids with disabilities, and it was just they love Yellow Submarine and Ringo's other song Octopus's Garden because they're like children's songs. And
well, back to the Yellow Submarine recording, and this is one where Jeff Emmerich was their man to try anything, and I think apparently they had, John wanted to sound like he was underwater.
Sure.
Or have the underwater of the submarine or something like that. And so Jeff Emmerich, I believe, wrapped the mic in a condom and put it in a jar, thing of water, but that didn't work out. And then they had a bathtub and they were rattling chains to get the sounds. And it was in Kenneth Womack's book, his biography on George Martin, I think he states that this is one of the most fun nights that George Martin had, most memorable experiences of everybody laughing and chipping in and trying to get this. And I think that when John is saying, like he's mirroring what Ringo's saying, that part where he's like the captain, he's like doing it through like the back of the Vox amp or something weird to get that echo sound.
They're trying to create a festive nautical atmosphere by adding all those sounds and figuring out how to do them. So I'm sure that was it was a lot of fun, and it does show up on the record. The record is fun, and it got parlayed into a story about a movie. And Donovan saw even a little deeper meaning in it, that they were kind of trapped within a kind of a mythical, their own submarine representing their prison, being a prisoner of their international fame.
You know, sometimes when you read these articles, the rock critic, and by the way, the rock critics kind of, really became to the fore with this album and beyond of analyzing the music. But, you can...
Gave them a job.
You can get them... You can get so deep in what people are saying. And so... I don't know that I'm not that deep. I want to take it for what it is. I love the music. How does the music speak to me as a musician? What do I want to learn from it or take from it? How do I want to write a song that maybe is influenced by that? But all this other stuff of that, and it's like the transcendental meditate, all this. It's a lot to take in.
It's not enough to me to take in. I can handle all of it, baby. I love it all. I think that there's layers of meaning. There's the time it was in. But when you just listen to the music...
What would John say? John would say, what a load of rubbish.
Yeah, well, he might say it was a load of rubbish, but then again, I think he secretly enjoyed the attention and analysis, and him being seen as the avant-garde, progressive person that he was. They think that he secretly enjoyed that. Of course he did, and Paul too. So, of course, the analyses just helps expand the legend. And speaking of that, you move into She Said, She Said.
Which is an interesting, great song. And there are a couple of important things to know about this song. And the first thing is that it's really
important. I thought it was not supposed to be important.
It's just interesting. How about interesting? It's
interesting.
Not, yeah.
Okay.
Jeffrey.
Okay. But yes.
Okay. So anyway, it's in, I believe in August of '65, the Beatles were in Los Angeles, and there was a party. Mm-hmm. In Beverly Hills, wherever, and the Byrds were there, and then Peter Fonda was there.
Jane Fonda's actor brother,
who, by the way, it was before Easy Rider and before really his fame.
He was on an LSD trip,
and he was and they were doing LSD, and Peter Fonda was concerned about George. He thought George maybe was dying, and he's like, I know what it's like to be dead, because apparently Peter Fonda accidentally shot himself in the stomach and was declared dead on the operating table. But he's walking around saying this, and John is like really pissed off. It's like John saying we had Playboy girls in there, and like I'm having this great trip with the girls and the dancing and the great ideas, and then here's this dude who we don't really know saying, I know what it's like to be dead, and and he's like, it's so boring. And who was this guy? It was before we didn't even know who he was, and so they were not. They
did not know he was famous. Is going to be famous actor. Peter
they were
Fonda,
not having it. What Peter Fonda was serving.
But Peter Fonda, legitimately did have some type of experience that he interpreted as a death and being revived from death. He really believed that, at least in his mind, or the psychedelia induced state he was in, and so John turned he into she. And then started writing it. And if you listen to the demos that I find on YouTube, the first demo tells it's better. It's very Dylan-like, didn't even resemble the song at all in the tempo or
not
anything.
At all. It sounds totally like a Dylan song.
Yeah, it sounded like a Dylan. Then he starts switching gears and switching tempos. It shows you how hard John worked to make a song come together. And finally, when the song is recorded, it was George Harrison that helped him piece together the various parts, because you have changes into different musical sections. When I was a boy, everything was right, and the guitar going dan dan dan. The rhythms, John, just like on Across the Universe, where you play with the rhythm. All right, that's what this song did. The time on it would shift, and just the way it was pieced together. And you can speak to this. Paul wasn't even in on the session. He didn't play on it at all.
I think that this was the 14th song that they needed to come up with, and they had a very tight deadline because they were going to be flying, I believe, to Munich to go on tour.
Their
And
final
it was
tour,
like
right?
really pressure. And so they rehearsed this song 25 times before even recording the basic tracks. And who knows, Paul has said in an interview, he goes, well, we had I think he called it a fight or something, and I must have said fuck off and went left. And so Princess Paul may have had his little hurt feelings that maybe John and George were bonding on this song or weren't listening to what he was saying, and he cut out of there. So
I'm not going to speculate on whether Paul was being
Princess Paul, perfectionist.
Right, I'm not going to speculate on that. Maybe that's quite possible. There's always a bit of rivalry in the group, but I think that George sincerely wanted to help John, finish the track and make it work. I think because he just dug the pieces of it and says, "No, this will be great." And then he helps on the harmony because Paul's not on it. And I always wondered why I'm not hearing a higher harmony part on that, and that's because Paul wasn't there. And I never knew that all of this time. The new things you discover when you explore this stuff is not just because it says the Beatles record doesn't mean that every Beatles on that song. And I think it's the same thing when the Beatles resented Paul for jumping ahead of them and doing more instruments on his own without them, and playing songs without them or writing songs where they were not needed. So I think that kind of pushed their individuality. And there you have, okay, well, why not have John and George hook up on something to help each other out? Maybe that was the right pairing. And it turned out that song is incredibly strong.
And George plays bass. And I think that Paul has said that he even though he's not on it, he really likes that song very much. It's one of his favorites.
Yeah, so just because he's not on it, he's generous enough to say that he supports it because why? Because he sees the band is a great band. That doesn't mean you all have to do the same thing or play the same instrument or be on the same track together. He had that spirit, I think
the thing that I think about is that here John and George are working close on several songs in this album, but by the White Album, John is essentially absent on most George songs. So something happened within that time frame. Who knows what, but it's nice to read when they're all working together well.
Right. I mean, the fact that one helped him structure, and that was a pleasant surprise to find that out.
Let's flip the side.
All right, let's flip the side into side two. If you are a fan of LPs like I was back in the day, you would be listening in England to side two, starting with Good Day Sunshine, Paul's piece of music. First, I think one of his earliest pieces of music hall, vaudevillian type, happy song about, again, romantic bliss and joy and an upbeat kind of song. A very kind of what we think of now as a typical Paul song, but
it's not about love at all, though.
But it's really not about this. It's about just having a great day.
No,
really, no.
Okay, that's
I have to.
You know what?
That's
I was thinking of "Got to Get You Into My Life."
No.
Good Day Sunshine is the beautiful
of summer
spring day that you just had that super day.
The beautiful spring day, and because in England in '66 that was an unusually warm spring and summer, which also helped inspire that. So when you hear the lyrics, "We take a walk, the sun goes shining down, burns my feet as they touch the ground," and then you hear this incredibly vaudevillian piano, dun, da, 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 da. Don't want to sing it, I want to get sued. But what I want to say is that part of it,
it's the wind up. It's the wind up.
It's
piano.
a Scott Joplin kind of ragtime.
George Martin perfected.
And George Martin perfected it and gave him that. And then towards the end, when he's repeating the song, the cascade of their voices, "Good Day Sunshine," echoing over each other, laying over each other as it fades. It's almost like visually, it's like a little film clip. You can see the spring, you can feel the spring, you can see the flowers suddenly blooming really big. There's a lot of color and positivity in that song, which is kind of really great that it's placed there and open side two, because it offsets a lot of the kind of the dark moodiness, I think, of some of the rest of the songs on the record.
It's inspired by the Love and Spoonful. What a day for a daydream.
Yes, and then Love and Spoonful. Remember, a whole bunch of genres are sprung out of just some of these tracks. So I thought that was a very masterful track by Paul. I think one of his best.
And the piano is quite prominent. His playing is improving.
Yeah, he's getting better. He's getting better all the time, as they say. And then the song segues into And Your Bird Can Sing, and which was not on the original American release. And I have to say, as a fan, ultimate Beatle fan, which was written primarily by John, although, of course, Paul claiming to have that it was really 80-20 and he helped out. Well, okay. But what's great about this song is that guitar riff. It's just incredible. And
it's a doubled riff between
Paul
and George.
Paul and George, Harrison and McCartney playing the dual lead guitar parts on the record. And there's that ascending riff. I mean, it just like magic. It just sticks to it. And it's also was written as kind of but the lyrics, although it's very upbeat and positive melody, the lyrics have that Lennon edge to it where is kind of cutting. When your bird is broken, will it bring you down? And they say it was directed at Frank Sinatra, which I didn't know until recently, that indirectly, because claiming he had this great life, perfect life, but you can't see me. You know, you have all this, but you can't see me. You can't be sensitive.
Well, the other thing is that they're saying that maybe it was against the Rolling Stones, and Your Bird Can Sing, the competition between the Beatles and the Stones, and Your Bird is Marianne Faithfull.
Well,
so that was something else that I read.
It said it was another critic said shaded put down of Dylan's Positively 4th Street. Someone who's seen 7 wonders, but yet unable to empathize with him. Okay, unquote. And then the song was according to Gould, the song was directed at Frank Sinatra after Lennon had read a hagiographic article on the Singer and Esquire about the fully emancipated male can have everything he wants. Well, okay.
I don't buy it.
You don't buy it? Well, I think it's possible. I mean, they're probably going, okay, Frank, here's one for you.
I don't think so.
But I don't know. It just sounds like a great track. I just love all the lyrics in it. Will it bring you down? You may be awoken. I'll be round. I'll be round. It's a positive thing. I'll be round, meaning, it's not nasty. I just think it's got a great drive, a great edge, a great melody. The singing on it, incredible. One of the best, John's best vocals, I think.
Well, I also, if you listen to the anthology version of this, where they're laughing, John and Paul are laughing hysterically. Maybe they're high as a kite, who knows? But they're just giggling and laughing as they're trying to get through the song. So it's...
And they played a lot faster, I think, as I recall.
Or it might have been sped up, who knows?
It was definitely sped up or something. It was very fast on that. It's just a great song. I thought that should have been a single, but it was used on, I think, the cartoons, the Beatles cartoons.
Yes, I think
if I recall seeing they used to have Saturday morning Beatles cartoons, folks.
And those were the days.
Those were the days. So I love that song. So anyway, I don't know what else you want to say about it, but we should.
I'm going to talk about For No One, because where you loved Here, There, and Everywhere, my favorite.
I didn't say it was my favorite. Paul, I just said it was great.
Is For No One.
Yeah.
And I think, oh my God, what was the original title? Something about, like, did it have to die? I'd have to look exactly. It's something in that
like
frame.
Love Dies or something like
something. It's just an amazing. I think it's like this small little song that has so much, and it's really the deconstruction of a relationship. And it's
totally.
If I was his better half listening to this, I'd be like, uh-oh. Yeah. Because it's
and in her eyes, you see nothing.
He paints. He paints the picture.
Right, totally. It's totally about the disintegration of his relationship, inspired by his relationship with Jane Asher at the time.
And even John said that's a good one. And it really is a good one. And
you have the descending piano part, and then you have the bass and he plays what's called a clavichord. And
so the clavichord is something that you'd have to Google a picture, but it has it has the wooden cabinet, and it has sometimes some of them have black keys and white small whatever they are, the sharp notes and stuff like that. But George Martin says he went home to bring in his clavichord, and others. This is from the George Martin biography by Kenneth Womack.
Right.
Says that he had to rent the clavichord, but Paul played the clavichord. I mean, Paul played everything, and so. And
you had Starr on drums, percussion, very light,
very light.
Light.
The big thing is that they had
a French horn solo,
and Paul had said he always loved the sound of the French horn growing up, and so when he heard the song, he wanted the to introduce the French horn into it. So
Right.
just get the French horn guy, and
Alan's name is Alan Civil.
George Martin got the Alan Civil was the best French horn player,
And Philharmonia Orchestra.
and came in, and there's quite a discrepancy between what Paul says and what others say who were in the studio, which was that I think that Civil says that he didn't have, there was no score written, there was nothing. It was just basically play this, and Paul like humming. Now, George Martin says that as Paul was humming, he's like sketching the notes. And at the end of the notes, I think it was an F that he had written down, and Alan Civil says, "Oh, George, did you make a mistake?" And then Paul and George are giggling because that F is way high, and you'd have to be a brilliant player, and they typically wouldn't push the envelope by playing that. So Alan Civil delivers an amazing French horn solo, and he hits the note. Fabulous. And as George Martin said, he goes, Paul didn't appreciate how brilliant that was, because Paul's like, well, I think we could do it a little bit better.
Okay, well, Paul didn't thought he knew more about classical music than he did, but that's okay. I mean, he was young. They were figuring it out. It was beautiful. It was brilliant.
Yeah, but they were saying his face. The guy's face was like,
I'm sure.
Oh my God.
Well, I'm sure that's not, and I agree with you. I think that's probably not the only instance when they did bring in outside people that sometimes their own technical ignorance of certain things about instruments or music are going to happen, and that's why you needed someone like a producer like George Martin that did know those things. But I think like getting back to the main point of the song, I think that the song has lyrically that and the way it's sung kind of an emotional detachment, because he's detaching himself from the relationship.
Your day breaks, your mind aches.
Right. And and because he's holding back or feeling detached from it, that makes it the impact even stronger. It makes it, you know that he's trying to control his emotions, which would probably run much, much deeper under the surface. So this was obviously a very heartfelt song, but with the lyrics kind of in a detached way, trying to say, okay, this is the uncoupling, this is happening, this is the reality. I don't like it, but he's not being overly dramatic. It's being almost understated the way he sings it, and that just doubles the impact for me. It makes it sadder. So what a brilliant piece of work in that. And I don't know if you have anything else to say about that, but you did bring up a good point. I mean, when you bring in outside people, and sometimes you presume that you know and you don't. You need to humble yourself a bit and allow them to do what they do.
Well, it must, in the biography that Kenneth Womack wrote, there's quite a bit of real estate devoted to this interplay between Alan Civil and Paul and George Martin, and what was happening in Jeff Emmerich's recollections as well. So, Alan Civil will always be remembered first and foremost for that French horn solo in that song.
Oh yeah. He staked his place in history.
You know what? I can remember our father, my dad, who was a musician, hearing that and was just like blown away and saying, that's really remarkable.
Oh, he did?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know he said that. Yeah. Oh, there you go. I'm learning something new all the time. This is great about Beatles music. You can just keep diving deeper and deeper and then discover new facts, new things about these songs. If we want to transition into the next song, which did not make the original U.S. cut, but it was called Dr. Robert, written mostly by John, and although McCartney since claimed co-authorship, and it's a guitar-based song in the style of And Your Bird Can Sing, all that stuff. But it's mostly about a doctor who gave...
it's a doctor in New York who would give
amphetamine.
B12 injections with amphetamines to special clientele, to the rich and the famous perhaps. And so you knew where to go. You'd go see Dr. Robert. And as Paul said later in like the Barry Miles biography, he said, well, not that we needed that or did that, but that was available. And again, we haven't really talked a lot about the drugs and the LSD, and Paul was hesitant on taking LSD. He was the last one to take it.
Right.
And so here John, George, and Ringo are having this eye-opening experience of walking through different doors and seeing things differently and feeling about things differently. And Paul's just kind of doing his avant-garde and doing that, but he's holding off, and I'd have to go back and look at when he actually...
He was seeking intellectual stimulation instead of
when he actually
experience.
took LSD, which also helped open his eyes too. But, Dr. Robert, I usually skip that one.
It's okay. I
okay.
think the part when I listen to that song, what I wait for is that wonderful well, you're feeling fine over the harmonium where the drums stop, everything stops, and you just hear the harmonium. And it's almost like a choir of boys singing, okay, we love you, Dr. Roberts, is their way of saying, okay, paying homage to this guy for opening our minds, blowing our minds. To me, that's just one song that kind of sounds a bit dated to me now. So yeah, it's kind of, sometimes I'll let it play and listen to it and think it's cool, but sometimes I'll just hit the skip button, especially now that I know what it's about.
I'd have to go back and see what John said about it.
He said it was about drugs.
Now, in his 1980 interviews, would he say that's kind of a throwaway song or, I don't know.
He said that's just about, he didn't really say it was a throwaway. He just, it's just about drugs. That's it. He didn't. He was dismissive of it. So even John wasn't all that crazy about it. But it well-recorded track. Everything was well-recorded. Doesn't mean the material lived up to it. But
another George song I want to tell you, which I have to say, it always sounds to me like it's recorded out of tune.
No, I don't think so. I was reading on the Beatles Bible, and sometimes I go look at the commentary. Some of you fans out there, if you're listening, someone said, I don't really like that particular song because the piano is discordant. I'm thinking, well, isn't that the whole point? The whole point of the song, that's what I think is actually cool about it. All right. Well, I have to say that it's about the avalanche of thoughts. Well, that means that he's trying to struggle to communicate, and communication is hard. And I have all these great insights, and I've taken this fantastic drug, and I'm having these mind-blowing experiences, but I don't know how to say it to you. I want to tell you about it, and so I don't mind. So you hear that discordant piano go ding, 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 ding. That little part was done deliberately. And when I was an 11-year-old kid, I'm thinking, yeah, that sounds kind of off. Why are they doing that? Right? I didn't understand it then. But now I hear it later, and then you hear George had gone on stage with other bands like Eric Clapton's band, and they performed that song. The audience loves it. It was ahead of its time. It said, threw in that discordant chord on purpose because it fits the tone of the song, which is I want to communicate this, and I'm having a little trouble doing so. That's all. I think it's a great George song, and it rocks. Ding, 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 ding. The refrain on it, the guitar refrain, that's a great hook that George came up with that repeats over and over. And then you hear Ringo's drumming coming in. Let's not dismiss his participation in this. It's kind of like a mid-tempo rock song with that kind of edge. I mean, here's where George was like the edgiest, I think, in that period. He softened up later. I think that George had really communicated his edge in his songs as a songwriter. Let's put this in perspective. George came of age in this thing as a songwriter, and I think Paul kind of came of age as a songwriter on this record. So that's what I love about it. I think it's a brilliant song. So
then we have Got to Get You Into My Life, which is quite a popular song, and it's many say a tribute to Motown and that sound. And, one of the things the Beatles always wanted was that they wanted the American style recording. They wanted loud bass, they wanted prominent bass, they wanted just to have a different energetic feel, which they were less than satisfied. So they were really trying to do that. And by the way, on this album, they were miking Paul's Rickenbacker bass differently so that it was much more prominent. And you can hear that with Paperback Writer and Rain. Again, talked about that in greater detail in an earlier podcast. But Got to Get You Into My Life with the horns, with the brass. If you listen to the earlier versions, I'm so glad it didn't stop there, that it went to where it is now on the album. And I always thought when I was growing up, it was about meeting someone great, and love at first sight or really digging someone. But, Paul has since corrected the record on that and said it's about his ode to pot.
No, thank you, Paul. I don't know if he was serious about that or kidding, but.
And then John thought it was about tripping, being on a trip. I was alone. I took a ride. I didn't know what I would find there.
Well, I think that it's open to interpretation, but the idea of it being kind of Motown inspired is perfect. I think, remember, they wanted to record this. The Beatles originally wanted to use a studio in Tennessee. Where was it?
Studio Stax or something?
Stax Studios. It was Stax. And because that the owners of that studio wanted to charge some exorbitant amount. And yeah, you would have gotten big brassy players and that kind of raw feel that he would have wanted. Paul also commented that had they done Eleanor Rigby there, the American string players didn't have the same kind of tonal character or quality that the British players had, so that would have been worse. So some tracks might have been better, like Taxman there. They think that the raw quality that he wanted. But I think that in Britain, they still managed to pull it off. And we were talking about this earlier today, that the players didn't have an arrangement set up
the
for
brass
them.
players that they brought in.
Right, they didn't have one, so they kind of said, well, we want something like this, and then John would be up there in the control room motioning to them and give them a thumbs up. Yeah, we like that one. It was really fun. I mean, they were able to make their own arrangement, but they're jazz players, so they're able to improvise and come up with something that fit the tone of the song and the drive of the song, and it worked. And
Paul felt it wasn't bold enough, so I think that Jeff Emmerich did his studio magic and doubled it somehow, and then affected the sync so that it sounded wider and sounded like it was a doubled sense of brass. And it is really, it's a fun song to listen to. And it's another thing that they said is that when Paul was doing the lyric, that John is really coming down, like, "It's great job, like keep it up." And it was just one of his great vocals in the studio.
Oh God, yes, an incredible vocal in that song. He really kicked it. Paul just tops himself all the time, and that was a great vocal. And when you hear the brass refrain, ba 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 ba, just reinforcing that, it's very jazzy. Too.
It is, and I think it's the influence also of the Beach Boys. And
that
Pet
too.
Sounds, of that.
Well, they were doing all kinds of things like placing the mics inside the bells of the brass and all that. I mean, they were there, and then they would have a slight tape delay later, which almost doubled the sound, the impact. So they wanted that kind of fullness in it, and it works. It just works. It's just a killer song, a killer track, and so much so that what R&B group paid tribute to that in a Beatles cover? Well, Earth, Wind and Fire, who used brass all the time and knew how to do it, and they did their own incredibly great version of it too. So,
well, and this was '66, and by 1969 and '70, brass with Blood, Sweat and Tears, Chicago Transit Authority, brass was such a big part of the songs. So maybe the Beatles influenced that as well. So final song on side 2, and I would say this is like one of my top 5 songs, Tomorrow Never Knows, because it's so different. I love the essentially one chord, even though some argue there's really 2 chords because something was a loop had a different chord in it. But Tomorrow Never Knows, and truly talking about, it was influenced by Timothy Leary's book about the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
His version of it,
His version of it, and Turn Off Your Mind, Relax and Float Downstream. Originally entitled, Jeffrey, The
Void.
The Void, but they felt that would not sell. Not be very
Tomorrow
popular.
Never
It was too
Knows
much.
is another one of Ringo's titles. Ringo is good at coming up with these titles, unusual titles, probably because of his lack of knowledge of proper English, so
I just think he's a funny guy.
I mean, he's just
guy.
funny. He's able to come up with these things. He's clever and fun and smart in those ways. So, Hard Day's Night, Tomorrow Never Knows. We thank Ringo for these great titles, and then the amazing drums on that record. I just could not believe the drumming on it. It's just so.
Well, and here's where the influence of Paul's avant-garde, which is they all had tape machines at home, and they were beginning to do all the tape loops. And when you hear that seagull sound in the beginning, that's really Paul laughing. And it's been cut up and sped up, and all these different loops. And if you go to YouTube, Giles Martin, who's George Martin's son, goes through and pulls up the slides for
6
each
of them.
tape loop.
6 loops,
which were interspersed in there, and it's just like, well, I think what did John want? He goes, "I want to sound like I'm standing on top of the what some mountain with a Dalai Lama."
The Dalai Lama answers, "Well, that'd be kind of expensive, John. George, how do you want to do that?" So they figured out a way to put his
He sang through a Leslie speaker.
Well, basically two revolving Leslie speakers inside
Which
some
are
case
used
or something. And that was during the middle part when love is all and love is everyone. And he sounds like he's, God speaking through a little microphone, speaking to you through, it was just so ethereal. It just fit perfectly. And then the bits of orchestra that were put in there. And then there's also a guitar tape loop that was run through as well. They had the usual guitar riffs sped up. I don't know what they did with it, but it's also the engineering, the studio work. The studio itself became an instrument in that song.
Totally.
And they could not reproduce that exactly the same again. They can't.
No, and in fact, what they said is that they could never, ever... it was all live in how they did the faders, and that they could never replicate that. That it was that was that moment of how they did work together.
You could say that Jeff Emmerich and George Martin were the two
co-creators
co-creators and main musicians, along with Lennon and Ringo, pretty much dominating that song. It was just tape loops, and thank goodness they were playing around with that stuff, because what happened after that? Well, gosh, that helped create a few careers, didn't it? It opened up electronica.
55 years later, I mean, they're still using samples and loops, and here the Beatles were ahead of that, and there's so much interpretive, the commentary on the impact that the Beatles did. You can go check that out, but it is very true. But what I love is I do love that sitting on that one chord, which is, it's the drone. I love that droning sound. Now, what's interesting is that George Harrison, I think, later on said that he didn't really feel that John understood the turn off your mind, relax and float downstream. That he may have sang about it, but he didn't really understand it, which is another
George sorry.
George-ism.
George wanted to claim on the spiritual path. So
he really didn't understand that. So
I think that John understood plenty. I think John found what he needed and used it, and took whatever philosophy in that suited him, and then was also free to discard it when it didn't. So I think that was just John's nature, and John was an open-minded, open person. He's a Libra after all, and he wanted to find balance. And in that song, he's just this album in total shows that you could do anything. The communication of this record is that even though these are all disparate songs and styles and these different personalities now have come fully to the fore, that you can still be together as a group, but you can also be individuals. And that you can do literally any style of music that you want. You can play with the studio, you can play with backwards tapes, you can do whatever you want and still make a great record out of it. And it's a masterful achievement. That's why I think it's as an album, as a one piece. There are individual songs we can argue back and forth on. But you look at it as one piece, it's brilliant. And in the same recording period, you had that great one-off single, which also, if you had 16 songs on the record, you could have added them easily.
Paperback Writer and Rain.
Fits right in with it. The same recordings. Paperback Writer, another one of Paul's story songs.
With a rockin' bass and rockin' drums. And then the other thing I was going to say is a couple, months ago, I'm like, oh my God, I just read this thing that they're saying Frere Jacques in the background vocals. I never knew that. And so I'm listening to it, and they are, and then I sent it to Jeff. I'm like, listen to this. And I
didn't believe it. Okay, that's what they're actually saying? And
they
you
really
listen to it, and they are saying
it. That was Paul.
They were saying it. And it worked. And it works. All the backing vocals, the drumming on it is incredible. The guitar riffs, just really muscular. I think that one of what they changed the sounds on them. I don't know what they did there, but it's a rock piece, and it's a story song. It wasn't as popular
as a single.
No, it wasn't.
It was a big break between singles for them. The other thing I wanted to kind of close with is that the title, Revolver.
What about Rain?
Rain was amazing. I think, did we talk about Rain?
No, we did not talk about.
I talked a lot about Rain with Scott, but Rain. Tell me what you think about Rain.
I want to comment on Rain. I want to comment on the Rain. I love that ending where it goes, now come near. You do that part at the end where they're singing the backwards vocals, and just the drums on it, and the singing. It's a G CD. It's a very basic, musically a basic song, but it's about state of mind. This is the key. The whole album is about a state of mind, and Rain kind of summarizes that.
Oh, and they slowed that down.
And slow down, sped up, and
so
whatever they
just
did with it. I loved it. It was a great, that to me was the single. Paperback Writer was fun and rocks and is a great tune. But I think for me, preferably, I like Rain better.
And John wanted Rain over Paperback Writer, but George Martin typically sided with Paul. But you know what? Paperback Writer is good, but it's not one of my favorites to listen to.
It's a story song. Paul's good at that. He'd like to write little vignettes about other people.
Well, the title of the album, interestingly enough, Revolver, is that their art gallery friends like Barry Miles and I think Robert Fraser.
Right.
They didn't care for it because it had the connotation of a handgun. And, their point, the Beatles' point was no, it's much more than that. It's the revolving of the vinyl album, revolver of things revolving within life. And so, again, a bigger meaning, not being... But
John also made a comment that it doesn't really mean anything. People want to superimpose meanings on it, and it just means revolver. That's what it means. It doesn't mean anything. It's a title. Don't read too much into the title. It says, it spins on the record, spins, it rings, and then you have the great drawing on the front with focused on the Beatles' hair. It was in black and white, totally rebelling against all the super hyped color of all the other albums that were coming out that year, or the following year. No, they did it. Floss Foreman was great, did in black and white. They knew he had a college degree in art, but they didn't know that he could actually draw. They just trusted him. And it was brilliant. And he only was paid like, £40, which is not a lot of money back then, to do the record. But then later he won an award for the best album
He won
cover.
the Grammy.
He won the Grammy for it. So,
and then he also, that Brian Epstein wept when he saw the cover.
He just thought it was great.
Yes. And they said when they unveiled the cover that it was absolute silence. And Klaus thought, oh no, they don't like it. But they were I think they just loved it.
I think they were blown away.
Finally, Paul said something and broke the ice and said, "Oh my God, it's amazing!"
They were blown away by it, the creativity of it. It opened the door. It was this record. It was not just
and talk about state of mind.
The
focus on their heads.
They focused on their heads
and their profiles.
Exactly. That you get that message from this record, and then it's not just a part 2 of Rubber Soul. I think, as George Harrison had commented on it, I think it's beyond that. I think that it is a separate piece. It may be a continuation of some of what's on Rubber Soul, but no, but I think it's a first foray into their individual selves. It was groundbreaking, and opened the door to Sgt. Pepper, which got basically, I think, is a great album too. It just got more hype, and it got more public relations involved, and they packaged it and marketed it better.
Well, we also can't discount what was happening with the U.S. And again, back to John's comments and about Jesus Christ, and then the Beatle fans burning the Beatles albums. And so there was just the Vietnam War, and the Beatles were speaking against the Vietnam War. So a lot of things were happening socially. And plus, change is hard. And if your stars are taking drugs and they don't look like themselves anymore, then you're like, oh. So
the female fans would say the Beatles have gone crazy. They were good. The Beatles went crazy. No. And then therefore the male fans started tuning in more and listening into it more, and getting into this music. So they had required a newer audience. Some people stuck with them through everything, but some they lost a few and gained a few. And that's just how it is when you change. And some people weren't accepting of that. The more conservative part of the audience wanted them to keep doing the
happy love songs.
They didn't want all this other stuff because it was too bizarre for them. They had no experience of it. But there was no stopping, no turning back.
I just wanted to mention this before we close. The Revolver title, other titles they considered Abracadabra, which was already taken.
I know.
Was already taken by another band, thankfully. And then, again, here's back to the Ringo thing. Ringo said, how about After Geography, which is a play on the Rolling Stones' Aftermath?
Yeah, they had the Stones had an album called Aftermath. And then he split it into a school subject and said, After Geography. That's hilarious. I mean, there's just the different titles that they came up with. So, it was appropriate. And it's made this place in history. And nowadays, even all the critics say that it is, of the albums, the best albums. The fans may disagree with me. it's hard to pick a favorite or say this is the best album, but I think in terms of its importance and its place, we now know what it was, even though in the United States it was overshadowed, overcome by events at the time. When we look back on it now, it just gets better and better. So it's a great record and my personal favorite. If I had to pick one and be on an island with, that would be it.
Interesting. I would not choose this one, but that's okay. That's just
All right.
me. I would pick the White
That's
Album
just you.
and Abbey Road.
Okay.
Anyhow. Okay. So friends, thank you so much for joining us today for this podcast, for the Thank God for the Beatles podcast with Revolver.
Yes.
And we're available on all major podcast platforms, Amazon, Apple, Anchor, and etc. We also have iTunes. We also have a YouTube channel, and so we kind of put it up there as well. If you'd like to check it out and leave a comment, respond to comments there, or any suggestions or anything like that, or anything that you feel about the Revolver album as well. And we thank you for your time. Be well. Take care. Ciao.
See ya.